Members, it's the appointed time. We have a quorum. Let's get started. Let's invite the government officials to join us. We will use the request to speak buttons for this meeting. If you have picked a seat, please stick to that seat. Last time, on April 28th, we had a meeting. The Secretariat came up with a summary of the matters arising from that meeting. The government has provided a reply last week. We know the government's busy, so that reply came in kind of late last week. That reply is CB bracket 1454 stroke 2023 bracket 01. Let's wait for the officials to settle down, and then we will have them walk us through the reply, and then I will open the floor to questions from members. Permanent Secretary, would you be walking us through the reply? Settle down first. Thank you, Madam Chair. Last Friday, we provided a written reply in response to matters arisen from the last meeting. I will outline our reply. Annex A in our reply. The Electoral Secretariat put this question to us. So an applicant submits an application and then provides further information. And then there will be a deadline. So the question was, what about the government? Will departments be subject to deadlines too in replying to an applicant? So will the government restrain departments from asking applicants to submit further information on multiple occasions? So that's the question. Paragraph 2 in the paper sets out our reply. So simply put, yes, we will. Before an applicant puts forward the application, there's a pre-submission inquiry system. The applicant can go to the planning department. If needed, the Plan D will coordinate across departments. So for applications that have yet to come in, the Plan D gives the applicant advice, say on areas of environmental or traffic impact assessment, or what sort of technical studies will be required from the applicant. So our plan is that for the future, we will revise the relevant guidelines and set out these requirements. Departments address these pre-submission inquiries, and then after the submissions come in, the departments ask the applicant for information. When these processes happen, we will set deadlines for the departments to give a reply. The key comment should be given to the applicant by the departments as early as possible. We want to avoid a situation where the departments give the key comments halfway through an application is already underway. When that's the case, the applicant will need more time to process those key comments. For the Plan D, they will also keep an eye. They will keep track of the departmental responses when issues come up. The Plan D will let the Development Bureau know. And then the Development Bureau will handle the matter accordingly. Towards the end of the second paragraph, there's a piece of information. Under the Development Bureau, there's a Development Project Facilitation Office. That office keeps an eye on programs or projects involving residential flats with more than 500 units. When a technical department is supposed to give advice, but then the department fails to give a reply way after the deadline, this office can step in and coordinate by chasing that department up. So the work on this front can be stepped up in the future. Now turning to item B in our reply. Unregulated areas. What are the factors the Secretary for Development would consider in designating an area as a regulated area? Members drew our attention to the wording, that is, in promoting conservation. Members asked us to be more precise with the wording. Now, what we mean by conservation and what we mean by promoting. Whether that accurately reflects our policy intent, we will review the wording. At the next stage, we will move an amendment. Now, turning to paragraph C. We discussed regulated areas. Members raised a question. That was whether we would take this opportunity to review other provisions under the Town Planning Ordinance. The Director of Planning is the planning authority. Whether the Director has enough powers in gathering evidence and in investigation. Our reply is set out in paragraphs 5 and 6. Paragraph 5. There, we explain what pre-material date use means. The material date is the December 9th, 2022. That's the date when the bill was gazetted. The Land Department also took aerial photos on that day. So that's one way to help us gather evidence. That will help us establish what the pre-material data use was. Now, apart from the aerial photos from the Lands Department, the Planning Department also sent officers. They did not visit the entire new territories, but then the officers went to do a freezing survey on areas that may be designated as regulated areas. So these officers made the field visit. Say if there were structures, the officers would look at the number of stories there were. The officers also looked at what purpose those structures were put to, so detailed records were made under the current town planning ordinance. We have the powers to gather evidence that's set out in paragraph 6. Under section 22 of the town planning ordinance, we can see the powers of the planning authority to investigate the matter and gather evidence. Under section 22, subsection 1, the planning authority can enter the premises to gather evidence, even without a court warrant, as long as the planning authority has reasonable grounds for suspecting there are illegal development on the site. The authority can enter the premises. The planning authority can also go to the land registry to retrieve information about the landowner. And then, as the investigation goes on, if the officers from the planning department cannot enter the premises, and then under section 27, subsection 7, there's another power for the officers. This provision is effective. The relevant persons will be served with notices. They will be asked to provide information. So what do we mean here? Say we can serve a notice on the title holder of the piece of land. We ask the owner on a certain date who the occupier and who the responsible person was. That way, the planning authority can take action accordingly. And then under section 22, subsection 8, the planning authority asks the landowner to provide the information and the owner refuses to comply. Under section 22, subsection 8, such a refusal is an offense. We have reviewed section 22 of the Town Planning Ordinance. We believe the planning authority already has the power to gather evidence and investigate the matter. The power is enough. Experience shows that the power has worked in helping us instill prosecutions. Now I turn to part D of the reply. Again, this is on the regulated area. In a regulated area, before the material date there was development, that we will not be able to take action under the town planning ordinance. But then if such development is in breach of other statutes or in breach of the land leases, the relevant government department can take action in accordance with the other statutes or the land lease. Members suggested adding wording there like without prejudice or notwithstanding that, such that it's made clear that enforcement action can be taken. After the last meeting, we talked to the Department of Justice or DOJ. Our reply is set out in paragraph 8. Say Area A, which is a regulated area, there is development, or there was development before the material date. That development would not fall foul of the new Section 21F. But the new Section 21F under the Town Planning Ordinance does not stop the other statutes from applying to Area A. The provision does not say that the pre-material date use will not be subject to other statutes. So the meaning is clear. So the effect is that this person still has to comply with the other statutes for any development in Area A. Simply put, the new Section 21F will not affect the other statutes. For example, the Land Miscellaneous Provisions Ordinance Cap 28, that ordinance is about those occupying government land. And then Buildings Ordinance, if you want to submit a plan, the Buildings Ordinance applies. And then there's also the Waste Disposal Ordinance, which controls the disposal of waste even on private land. So the new Section 21F will not affect the operation of these three ordinances. The new Section 21F will not prevent the government from enforcing the land lease conditions. At the last meeting, towards the end, we touched on the point that we are amending the town planning ordinance. There are consequential amendments due to the amendments to the town planning ordinance. Members were clear-sighted. Members noted that for some consequential amendments, since we will be introducing a partial approval mechanism under the town planning ordinance, that change will be reflected in some ordinances but not the others. We have reviewed the changes. For the other statutes involved where consequential amendments feature, there are some places where the partial approval mechanism will not be inserted, and that's Cap 563, the Urban Renewal Authority Ordinance. Section 8, subsection 2 of the Town Planning Ordinance states that the partial approval mechanism does not approve to the plans made under Section 25 of the Urban Renewal Authority Ordinance. There's a reason. Those plans under Section 25 of the URA Ordinance have to do with urban redevelopment projects. They are different from the all outline zoning plans. OZPs cover a larger area, whereas the urban renewal developments cover maybe a couple of streets. Old buildings are required for redevelopment. So for the urban redevelopment projects, the projects have to be considered as a whole. So for the older buildings, they will be torn down. The URA looks at the gross floor area that will be made available. The URA also considers the financial viability of redevelopment projects as a whole. So we cannot look at individual parts of a redevelopment project. We cannot put part of the project to the Executive Council for approval. That simply does not work. We have consulted the Urban Renewal Authority on this point, and they agree with our view. For URA projects, the partial approval mechanism does not apply to the plans made under Section 25 of the Urban Renewal Authority Ordinance. Madam Chair, I will stop here.
One member would like to speak. Now 2 members, Mr. Tony Tse and Dr. Wendy Hong. 5 minutes each. Thank you, Madam Chair. For the administration's reply, from my perspective, one of the main purposes is to streamline the approval process so that we can take forward redevelopment projects in a more efficient manner. For the deadline of the applicant to submit further information, I support the setting up of a deadline, but how can we expedite it in the reply? It is good that before the formal application, the Planning Department can do some preparatory work. As I said last time, the department should be more proactive, as it involves different departments. If the department can expedite the work, despite the restrictions in the ordinance, at the end of the day, we want to implement the redevelopment projects as soon as possible, so whether before or after, time is of the essence. I hope that the department will comply with all the guidance and instructions. So let us give it a try. Let's see if we can make things work faster. I will monitor the situation to see whether the department will really proactively take forward the project. The word key matters. If things don't work, then the applicant will think twice. They may not want to expend a lot of resources, and that is what I want to say. Thank you, Madam Chair. Permanent Secretary, any response? Thank you, member, for your comment, and I agree with Mr. Tony Tse. For planning applications, it is indeed worth efforts to do well in the preparatory work. I understand that government departments also have the responsibility, and we need to tell applicant our material comments. If these material comments are only given to applicant at a very late stage, it is indeed quite difficult for the applicant to withdraw the application or to change their stance. Put it this way, it is a cultural change. Let us work hard together. And we do want to do better in terms of preparatory work in this regard. Dr. Wendy Hong. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to follow up on this. In the planning applications, we need to restrict the situation in which the administration kept asking the applicant to provide further information. Under A, Planning's Department, as well as the Development Projects Facilitation Office, what is their division of work? Will there be a project officer under which department? For paragraph 8 under D, there is a material period governing the use of the regulated area. But for 21F, Will there be further exemptions? Is there a material date under other ordinances? Do we only have material date under the town planning ordinance, or do we still have other material dates under other ordinances? For pre-application consultation services, what is the difference between that and the Development Projects Facilitation Office? The Planning Department deals with rezoning or planning applications. After obtaining the approval of planning, then they still have to discuss land premium, land leases, etc. But then the Development Projects Facilitation Office is a one-stop office. For any difficulty about land lease, land plan, etc., they can also seek assistance. Regarding material date, yes, indeed, it is under the town planning ordinance. There is no such concept under other ordinances. Mr. Louis Long. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to follow up on what the Permanent Secretary said. The Development Projects Facilitation Office, or the streamlining matter under the non-statutory matter. The Development Projects Facilitation Office, or DPFO, only handles certain projects, or those with a cap of amount. In the course of development, different approval departments from the government will be involved. For District Lands Conference or District Planning Conference, the trade finds that the government is very big on pleasantries. So when exchanging opinions, there is a lot of alliteration. There are suggestions back and forth. So for land conference or planning conferences, well, definitely there has to be a person in charge. They cannot be too democratic. So there could be a land authority and a planning authority responsible for the land conference and the planning conference respectively. We cannot seek opinions without a time frame. Aside from legislative amendments, what matters is that how we can foster interdepartmental collaboration and how they can give their own opinions. At a certain stage, then, there must be someone, a person in charge, who will make a decision. Permanent Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Louis Long. Indeed, for this bill, it is all about statutory procedures. In my discussion in the previous meetings, I understand that administrative procedures are very important, especially in relation to enhancing speed. When it comes to administrative procedures, as I reported, we have started conducting a review. Regarding what Mr. Louis Long said, DLC and DPC, I do agree. We need to have ample discussion, after which there must be someone who will make the decision, and that is the responsibility of a chairperson. I will discuss with the commissioners or the directors to see how we can enhance the efficiency of the conferences. Thank you. Permanent Secretary, I also have a question, a follow-up. You mentioned the DPFO. . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 。 . 。 。 . 。 。 。 . 。 。 . 。 。 。 。 。 。 。 。
。 . 。 。 。 。 。 。
. 。 . 。 . 。 Was there a development opportunity office? What are the similarities between these two offices? Will the DPFO actually replace the DOO? Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, actually, for DOO, as the Madam Chair said, we do not have the DOO right now. That was something in the previous government departments. Well, I mean, that was something established in the previous governments. It reviewed projects one by one. For now, the DPFO, its main function be it land administration, town planning, etc. If there are any hiccups, we hope the colleagues working under the Bureau can step in as soon as possible to see how we can better coordinate the work, to see how we can come up with a solution that is acceptable to both the administration and the applicant. Some may worry that departments probably have a delay in answering applicants' questions. The DOO's head was Tommy Yuen, but then it used to be Laurie Low. Well, Laurie was D3, if I remember correctly. So what about the DPFO? Is the person in charge of the DPFO capable enough? Is the person well experienced enough? The head of the DPFO is a PRSC. That is to say, the position holder was a civil servant. Previously, the position holder used to work in the government, holding the capacity of a director. Probably 2 to 3 years ago, the position holder handled dozens of cases. The position holder was the director of the buildings department. And by and large, the service was deemed satisfactory. Next, Ms. Carmen Can. In expediting the work, there should be administrative guidance. It may not be set down in the ordinance, but then people will know whom they should turn to. I noticed in D, well, under 131, Mr. Louis Long mentioned there is no such concept of material date, and I'd like to hear from the legal advisor. Do you agree with the administration? If we are not going to use the words without prejudice and notwithstanding that, will we use to avoid doubt, that is in Chinese 为民商议, so as not to hinder the execution or implementation of other ordinances? Without aerial photographs, will there be a misunderstanding?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I thank the member for her question. In the government's reply, there's this point, and I agree. In other ordinances, you have something similar. The drafting, as it stands now, does not preclude the application of other ordinances, so this is the appropriate way to go. But members would like to see the rules being spelled out more clearly so we can see what the government has in mind. Any follow-up questions from Ms. Carmen? So my question for the government, can you spell out more clearly the department people should turn to? Permanent Secretary. Just to clarify, is the member saying that before the applicant submits a planning application, are we asked to spell out clearly what kind of information is needed? So this is about guidelines. People need to know what's expected of them in an application. So now we will resume our clause-by-clause scrutiny. Before we wrapped up the last meeting, we were at clause 1, 2, 3 in the bill. So today, we will look at the marked up copy, the Chinese version, CB 165 2023 record 01. So that would be 0287 in the English copy. We were at the private columbarium ordinance, consequential amendment. Ingrid, please walk us through the changes. Thank you, Madam Chair. So a brief overview of what we did. The last consequential amendment we covered was the change to Cap 630, the private columbarium ordinance, as we said last time. Under that ordinance, when someone applies for specified instruments for private columbarium, exemptions, licenses, etc., that columbarium cannot be an unauthorized development under the town planning ordinance. Now, under the town planning ordinance, we will introduce a mechanism for regulated areas. In that area, pursuing unauthorized development will be against the law. So under Cap 630, we will have to add references to the regulated area. Last time we were at clause 17. So now we're at section 111 on page 2087. So these are some adaptations, some exceptional cases. Say you have unauthorized development under the town planning ordinance, but if such development is necessary for the columbarium, so that's section 111, subsection 1. Or if the unauthorized development falls under the conditions under subsections 2, 3, or 5, and then there is approval, then the relevant sections under the town planning ordinance will not apply. Since we're inserting 21F as for regulated area under the town planning ordinance, we will insert references to section 21F here under this ordinance too, Madam Chair. Any questions? Mr. Louis Long. Madam Chair, a question about the wording. Effect of town planning ordinance modified. I'm not familiar with the Chinese wording. It's modified in English, but the word modified creates the impression that something doesn't add up. How do you modify the law? Is it a common wording in Chinese? Who's going to take the question, please? The Department of Justice can tell us more about this. Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, this is a common term for modification we use in Chinese 变通. So this is not something unique to this ordinance. Any other questions? No, Madam Chair. If not, let's go to the Land Resumption Ordinance. So that's page 1 of the marked up copy. Madam Chair, we're done with the town planning ordinance. We will now move on to the land resumption ordinance. Before we get into the clause-by-clause scrutiny, I want to ask my colleague, Polly, who will show you some slides. She will walk you through the major changes in the proposal. Thank you. So let's get Polly to walk us through the changes. Thank you, Madam Chair. With the aid of the slides, I will talk about the structure of the land resumption ordinance and the main proposals. Now we're looking at different parts of the land resumption ordinance. We will be adding headings so that you can see the structures clearly. There are 8 parts to the bill we draft. First, you have the preamble. So we are defining the various terms under the ordinance. And then we are making changes to the interpretations. The changes include the statutory process for dealing with objections, and also for the interest rates for unpaid compensation, and also for owners of adjacent land to apply for land resumption. So we are making changes to the wording. We are also spelling out that public use can cover roads, sewerage, or railways works. So that's part 1. Second part, the land resumption proposals. This is a new section to the ordinance. The purpose of having this section is to spell out that we have to publicize the land resumption proposal, and then there's a mechanism for dealing with objections. There are 4 elements to this part. The first key element is statutory time limit, 2 months plus 5 months. That's for collecting and dealing with the objections. The second element, who can raise an objection. We will spell out that the landowner or the occupier or someone with interest in that piece of land can raise an objection. The third element, objections based on compensation will not be dealt with under the statutory process because there is a separate mechanism to address that. The fourth element, we will spell out that we can have the land resumption and dealing with the objection. This is something that can be taken in parallel with the town planning ordinance. Now we move on to part 3, resuming land for a public purpose. This is in existing provisions. This part mainly covers the part where the Chief Executive in Council examines the land resumption proposal, and then once the approval is granted, the notice has to be put up. We will make changes. We will be improving the drafting to modernize the drafting. So for Section 3, it's simply drafted now. The Chief Executive in Council can approve a land resumption proposal. But then we have looked at other ordinances, so we decided to spell things out more clearly. Apart from granting an approval, the CEC can also has other options, so say rejecting it or reconsidering the proposal, etc. Under Part 4, or rather Section 4, now we will be putting out land resumption notices as the clauses now stand. But then we will propose to add a requirement where we will put out the resumption on the website of the Lands Department too. And then based on the members' comments, we will also add the requirement where we have to take out newspaper ads to tell people about the resumption. And then there's also redrawing or realigning the land boundaries. This is a new section. Once the CEC approves a resumption proposal, there will be a mechanism to deal with unforeseen needs, and then we can adjust the boundaries of the land to be resumed. Moving on to Part 5, claims and assessment of compensation. This is an existing part of the ordinance. This is on compensation, no major changes. Part 6, disposal and use of resumed land. This is a new section. This point has been dealt with multiple times. This contains Section 16AA. And we will insert section 16A subsection 1. So a resumed site, before it's put to the public use for which it's resumed, the government can make good use of the land by putting it to an alternative purpose. As we said in a written reply, we had a different proposal. The site could be put to a different public purpose after the land is resumed, but we will withdraw that proposal. And as we said in our last written reply, the temporary purpose will be subject to a time limit, and then there will also be requirements on the approval mechanism. We can dig deeper into that when we get to the clause-by-clause scrutiny. Part 7, compensation and the payment of interest. This is an existing part of the ordinance. The main proposal here is for the interest rate of the unpaid ordinance. This will be the 1-month HIBOR. This is the average HIBOR rate, Hong Kong interbank offered rate. And then moving on to Part 8, miscellaneous provisions. Most of them are new provisions. First, we will insert Section 18A. So for owners of adjacent land to a site that's resumed, that landowner can apply for the resumption for their plot 2. The primary reason here is that the remaining plots cannot be reasonably used. So now there's this mechanism for the landowners to get an application in. We propose to insert Section 19A. Once the land resumption proposal is approved by the Chief Executive in Council, the government can release the relocation compensation right away without having to wait for the funding works funding. This is to facilitate early relocation and compensation for the people affected. So these are our main proposals. If members have no other questions, then we can get started with the clause-by-clause scrutiny. Members, if you have questions, you can raise them during the clause-by-clause scrutiny. Over to Ingrid or Polly. Polly will walk us through. Now, page 1, we're inserting a title there. And then we move on to page 2, the interpretation. As I said just then, the changes have to do with our proposals. On the slides, you can see the main proposals. First, the interest rate for outstanding compensation. We are amending the wording. The statutory requirements now is to have the interest rate no less than the 24-hour deposit call or notice. We propose to replace that with the 1-month Hong Kong dollar interest settlement rate. That's why in page 4, we propose to remove working day. And then we're also proposing to remove the non-working day and the note issuing banks from the interpretation. To replace them, on the right-hand side of page 4, you will see the reference interest rate. This is the 1-month Hong Kong dollar interest settlement rate published by the Hong Kong Association of Banks. That's our proposal. Polly, we put this question to the government once. Why adopt this HIBOR rate? I don't recall the reason. Could you refresh our memory? We adopt the minimal level of the law, that is the 24-hour notice for deposit. Many landowners are not happy with the rate. They think it's too low and that's not good enough. So we try to come up with a better rate. But then we have to strike a balance when we make changes. The interest rate is there to compensate landowners for late receipt of compensation. There are a variety of options out there. So a middle-of-the-road rate will be the 1-month HIBOR rate. That rate is comparable to the time deposit on the market. We believe that offers reasonable compensation to the loss of the landowners. We're also striking a balance since public funds are involved. Thank you. Mr. Lewis Long, a question from you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to restate my point. The court has been using P+1. But we need to spend public funds wisely. We need to think why we have compensation of interest. That is because the landowner has not yet received your compensation after the resumption of land. So that is reasonable in accordance with the basic law. You have to compensate the landowners with a suitable interest rate. With the HIBOR rate among different banks. That is an interest rate available to them. But then for an ordinary landowner, it is impossible for the landowner to obtain financing. So after all, using the court's judgment P+1 is a more reasonable way of compensation. I understand your point. We have different views on different levels of interest rates. Indeed, there were judgments in which P+1 was used. That usually involves business operators. The court was of the view that in those cases, probably the person involved had to obtain commercial financing. But when it comes to land resumption, that is not the case. Most of it is all about land resumption and the compensation. After all, when we disperse compensations, it takes time for us to verify the land title. So probably we can work more on land title vetting. The Lands Department is reviewing this line of work. Can we communicate with the landowner earlier? For example, for the preparation of deeds, can we do it faster? Can we disperse the compensation earlier? That will also reduce interest rates. It may be a well-intended plan, but then you cannot guarantee. Can you? So, can you work out some performance pledge so that the person whose land is resumed will not suffer much from the default of compensation payment? Let us continue. I've covered amendments in relation to interpretation, and now here comes the second. Prescribed public uses can cover the relevant road works, sewerage, and railway works. On page 3, let us cross the definition of public use. And you can refer to pages 4 to 5. For A, B, C, and D, they are from the previous ordinance. What is added? Well, excuse me, it should be A, B, C, and G. These are old. For D, E, and F, they are newly added. Let me explain the reason for the amendment, which is quite technical, with a couple of slides. For some projects of public purposes, also under Cap 124 Land Resumption Ordinance, some of them actually covered land required for work, sewerage, or railway works. Usually they are public housing developments or new development areas. Let me call it a large area. There are different roads, sewerage works, or railway works. For these works, they are governed under specific ordinances. There is no ordinance saying that Cap 124 can cover road works, so we will have to gazette in a separate manner. For this graph, for example, there is a yellow graph and a blue graph. In the yellow area, we will gazette the yellow area separately. For the land resumed under Cap 124, they will be gazetted in yet another graph. This approach is quite piecemeal. That is from the perspective of the reader, and it also takes time for us to make the plan. Given that we know the whole area is required, but then we need to wait until the alignment is completed before we can make the gazette. Usually, that takes up a lot of time. And to the public, they do not understand the big picture. For example, how much land has to be resumed, they have to combine different graphs before they can tell. Public use can actually cover the relevant road, sewerage, or railway works. So what is the effect? That is the graph on the right. For the area on the right, this piece of large land can be resumed under Cap 124. The making of the plan will be more efficient. We can also expedite the gazette process so that we can resume land more expeditiously. This will also be a more systematic way. Applicants do not have to submit the applications under two regimes. They can do it in one go under one regime. Mr. Andrew Lam. Regarding this amendment, this is a groundbreaking amendment. It is also very effective. It is a good policy indeed. With G, you've covered the base actually. There may be non-roads or non-railway public works. So in choosing which ordinance to choose, you may have to remind your colleagues. They have to tread cautiously. Otherwise, there may be problems. Despite subsection G. Thank you, Mr. Andrew Lam. We indeed have considered this. We have thought about the type of works covered under these ordinance. Usually, they are road works, sewerage works, and rail works. And we will tread cautiously when there are any problems in the future. Mr. Andrew Lam and I have the same point. Our concerns are similar. About land resumption, public uses are actually all-encompassing. Whenever you will resume land, it's all about public purposes. But you do have your concerns. For road, sewerage, and railway works, they are the major components. But as Mr. Andrew Lam said, well, we don't know, there may be other works. Mr. Andrew Lam also mentioned subsection G. It's a catch-all provision. For example, for road works, sewerage, and rail works, the applicants may not be able to tell. What about the information? They may not be able to tell them apart. Is it that easy? Is that simple? Thank you, Mr. Tse's question. That is the land resumption plan under Cap 124, and that shows what land is resumed. In relation to the smaller area for building public housing estates, for example, that might be more difficult. We need to buy time to finish alignment, etc. But when it comes to preparing for the project, such as a town planning plan or for public consultation documents, there are usually alignments of the project. It may not be very accurate, but there will be a sketchy alignment. For the Gazetted of the land resumption, we make it clear that public purposes cover roadworks, and we also tell the objectors clearly that this purpose is covered. When it comes to Gazetted, as Polly said, it can be more detailed, so we all know what is covered. That is, it covers different purposes. It may not be very accurate. We all understand this. But the whole purpose of land resumption, what is the purpose? What is the use? All of us will also understand the purpose of land resumption. I have a question. The interpretation includes, but it's not limited to, all these commonly seen public purposes. I have a question. Have there been any court judgments in relation to what constitutes a public purpose? And I myself don't know that subsection G has such a substantial catch-all right either. I don't know CE in Council has this right. For innovation technology, InnoPark, reindustrialization, is it possible? Can they be covered? For the definition of public purposes, in some cases, the court did discuss these concepts. With reference to a case dated 1996 to 1997, what constitutes a public purpose? The government will have to consider on a case-by-case basis, and it will have to refer to administrative law. All of it has to be in good faith. This is a rather broad statement or broad expression. We do have principles to remind us what constitutes public purposes, and I can share some elements with you. Usually, public purposes must have the feature of public. They have to be related to society as a whole. The land has to be used in good faith. Despite the wide provision, we also have principles to comply by. We need to play by the book. So what about for advanced manufacturing, InnoPark, Science Park, manufacturing base? Can it be seen as a public purpose? Well, by what you say, I think it could be a public purpose, but it still depends on the details. But if it is beneficial to society as a whole, it may be justified that it could constitute a public purpose. Mr. Lam San Kang. Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't quite understand the graphs. Are the yellow areas to be resumed, or are they for the projects? For the works? The yellow areas are actually the road alignments. We shade areas of the private land. So basically, the graph shows what private land to be resumed as well as the alignment. So what about that in the middle for the blue graph? That shows the land that is not used as roads. Well, put it this way. If you overlay the yellow one with the blue one, then it will become the larger picture on the right. For the current ordinances, they are done in a separate manner. So for the blue one in the middle, they are not to be resumed. They are not roads, but then they also need to be resumed. They are just resumed under different ordinances. So both of them make up the right one, the larger one.
Ms. Carmen Khan. I have a similar question to the one you just raised, Madam Chair. Under interpretation, we're taking out resumption for public purpose. There used to be A to D, and then we're now replacing that with 2 bracket A to G. We will have 6 paragraphs instead. Before and after, you see the word including. So even with the new interpretation, we're not setting out an exhaustive list. But I want to be clear on this point, resumption for public use. We used to have bracket A to D under 2G. As described in another paragraph to be decided by the Chief Executive in Council. Is the new provision clearer than the old one? Now, the old definition comes with Latin in it. So the new interpretation seems to suggest that as long as the use is considered to be a public use by the Chief Executive in Council, then the use is a public use irrespective of other factors. Madam Chair, you gave an example of an innovative development. Maybe a public-private partnership in innovation and development is considered a social good. The Chief Executive in Council considers that to be a public use, and then that settles the matter. That's a public use. So by public use, you're saying that you can have a development that is not public in the future. Is that the case? Madam Chair, let me explain this in greater detail. To A, B, C, and G, all of them are existing provisions. Just then, we talked about the catch-all mechanism, so that's bracket G. We have adopted that provision for other various purposes as long as you can justify the use that falls under bracket G. That's the same provision as we have now. D, E, and F, those 3 are the new provisions. Those 3 provisions give effect to what I'm showing you here on the slide. This is for land or works to be gazetted under the Road Works Use and Compensation Ordinance. This means road works. And then bracket E, this is the works proposed under the Road Works Use and Compensation Ordinance as applied under the Water Pollution Control Sewerage Regulation. And then bracket F, railway works under the Railways Ordinance. So those are the provisions. So D, E, and F are simply there to incorporate the compensation-related provisions under other statutes. And then bracket G is a catch-all provision. So if the site is used for scientific and innovation development, that's a public purpose. Ms. Carmen Khan was saying, what if you resume a site for scientific development and then you grant the land to a multinational to build a factory, manufacturing base? What then? Madam Chair, public uses do not preclude the use of the site by a private firm, especially in new development areas. The court has ruled that you want to have balanced development at the new development area. You need both public and private housing. So for new development areas, we take the land and then we can sell it to a private developer. So when the piece of land is used for public purpose, you can still have it sold to a private developer. We will adopt the appropriate approach depending on the circumstances of each case. Mr. Ambrose Lam. This Bills Committee focused on what public use means. Now I can see that bracket G here is a catch-all clause. But then back in 1996, the court handed down definitions of a public use. So why are we not incorporating the court's definition into this ordinance? That way, the Chief Executive in Council can consider what the court ruled in considering an application. So why aren't we incorporating the court ruling into this ordinance? Bracket G here gives the CENC broad powers, but they struggle to make a decision based on that alone. So why aren't we incorporating the court ruling into the ordinance? Polly, please. The court handed down principles, broad principles. The court said that in deciding what public use is, they have to act with good faith, not arbitrarily. These are broad matters of principle. Madam Chair, if we put those principles into the ordinance, then there are principles for the CENC to go by, so the CENC will not risk acting arbitrarily. Any response from Polly? I think that's not a concern, even if we do not include those things into the ordinance. The Department of Justice will serve as a gatekeeper in land resumption exercise. The DOJ will look at the principles laid down by the court. Madam Chair, I think the public will be assured if we put those principles into the ordinance. At the policy discussion, we focused on this matter. This point has been close to the heart of the members of this Bills Committee. So I propose incorporating those principles into this ordinance. Prince Permanent Secretary, we can revisit that point. But as Polly was saying, back in 1996, there was a ruling. The judgment laid down broad principles. If we do put those principles into the principle, would the public really find it clearer as to how the CENC will make a decision? Now, we can certainly consider Mr. Lam's comments. Can you show us a copy of the court ruling from 1996? I don't know which level of court it was. Back then, the cases had to go to the Privy Council. If you appeal it, if that case did not go to the Privy Council, it may be overturned. So you do have to revisit this point. Next, Mr. Lewis Long. Thank you, Madam Chair. A question for the legal advisor. For decisions made by the CENC, is that not amenable to judicial review? That is amenable to JRs. Yes. CENC's decisions are amenable to JRs. But I'm not too worried about this. Now we have the Department of Justice. I'm sure the DOJ is well versed in the relevant precedents. The decisions are open to JR. Let's move on with the clause-by-clause scrutiny. Let me return to this slide. The next item, the third rule, allowing landowners of adjacent sites to apply for resumption. That has to do with the change in interpretation of landowners. This interpreted definition now, we propose to remove the word government because there will be a mechanism in place for landowners to apply for land resumption. Now we propose 2 + 5 months as a time frame for dealing with the objections. We have inserted several new terms. First, land resumption proposal. Proposal for land resumption. The secretary means the secretary for development. There will be powers under the secretary. And then there will also be the notice of proposed resumption and fourth amendment notice. These terms have to do with the statutory mechanism of 2 + 5, that is a land resumption. I will go into greater detail in a moment. Mr. Andrew Lam. Sorry, Madam Chair. I have a question about the point where landowners of adjacent sites will be allowed to apply for land resumption. Do we have relevant examples? An applicant gets an application in. How long does the whole process take? Polly, the law as it stands does not specify a concrete process. We have adopted what's under the Road Use, Works and Compensation Ordinance and another statute. But when the mechanism is supposed to work, there will be administrative guidelines which will set out how things work. Madam Chair, I want this to be put on the record. We need clear guidelines and examples of how this mechanism will work. If there are no other questions, let us continue. So, moving on. That's part 2, a new section, a new part rather. This will be a new mechanism. Before the land resumption, the government has to publish the land resumption proposal and follow certain steps in dealing with the objections. Section 2A, Notice of Proposed Resumption. The goal of Section 2A is that we have to publish a notice of the proposal. That's under subsection 1. For land resumption for a public purpose, the authority, being the Lands Department, must publish a notice of the proposal in the Gazette. And then subsection 2. The notice of proposed resumption has to contain certain bits of information. First, a description of the public purpose. And second, a description of the land to be proposed to be resumed. Basically, this means the lot numbers. And we also need a plan of the land to be resumed. Subsection 3. The authority must publish the notice in a certain way and make the notice publicly accessible. We're adopting the provisions under the Roads, Use, Works and Compensation Ordinance and the Railways Ordinance. So the plan has to be deposited with the land registry. We're also inserting a requirement where the plan has to be made available online, and then at specified time and the places, the plan has to be available at government offices for public inspection. At the site to be resumed, notices will be put up. Subsection 4. This is about giving effect to the mechanism or the proposal where you can have the consultation and the proposal going ahead in tandem. When you have a plan under Cap 131 for public inspection, and then some sites will be resumed for a public purpose, in that case, the Lands Department can publish the land resumption notice so that the public inspection and the land resumption notice can go ahead in parallel. If there are no other questions, we can move on. Section 2B. Dealing with the objections to proposed resumption. Section 2B is there, stating that when someone wishes to object to a land resumption proposal, there are requirements that apply. Subsection 1. There will be a time limit. Once the land resumption notice is up, and then within 60 days, the written objection has to come in. Under subsection 1, there is a requirement on who gets to raise an objection. So you have the owner or the occupier of the land, and also a person having any right in relation to that land. Occupier. So are we talking at the unlawful kind? That's occupier in English.
Now, subsection 2 about the objections. That person has to state the identity of that person, that is the occupier, and how that person will be affected. Now, next, 2C, amendment notice. The purpose of an amendment notice is that after the it states that we need to post an amendment notice. After collecting objections and we want to touch up a bit, then we will use the amendment notice. In subsections 2, it states what the land resumption notice has to cover, including the amendment, a plan. Then, in subsection 3, it states other details. That is, it has to be made available for inspection by the public free of charge at the time and place as the authority reasonably directs. Mr. Louis Long, I'd like to ask, in the new territories for Chotong land, there are a lot of Chotong lands in the new territories. So how do you define they are the occupiers or the landowners, they are managers? Can you tell us simply how you can define them? Regarding who can raise objections, apart from the landowner and the occupier. There are a lot of people who have a right in the land. There could be a wide array of people. Taking Chotong land, as Mr. Louis Long said as an example, for manager of the Chotong land, they can raise objections and they do not need to collect all the objections of other people before they can raise an objection. No question? Then we can continue. Just now we were on page 9. Subsection 4. It also concerns the town planning ordinance. This provision will enable us to conduct public consultation in parallel. Then, can you explain more clearly? So after a plan, then you have to resume the land and then you will carry out the works in tandem. Is that correct? Yes, we will carry out the works in tandem. We do not want the public to misunderstand that we can only start after all the procedures with the town planning board are completed. We can actually carry out the works in tandem. On to 2D, objections relating to the amendment notice. It concerns amendment notice in 2C. If someone would like to object to the amendment, what are the criteria or requirements of submitting the objection? It is similar to 2C. There is a time frame within 60 days. Who has the right to raise objection? A and B as well. That is, an owner or occupier of the land affected by the amendment, or a person having any right in relation to that land. Subsection 2 also states what the contents have to be covered in the objection. Regarding 2E, supplementary provisions relating to objections. The purpose of the 2E is to insert some supplementary provisions in relation to objections. Subsection 1. This section applies if a person makes an objection under under section 2b or 2d. That is, an objection under section 2b or 2d will also be subject to 2e. Regarding subsection 2, compensation or assistance, they will not be dealt with in the statutory procedures. Subsections 2 and 3 are all about this. In subsection 4, 5, 6, together with 9 and 10, we take a look at them together. All of them concern the interactions between us and the objector in the course of objections. As usual, we will send a reply to the objector as soon as possible explaining our stance. If they require supplementary information, we will provide them with supplementary information. If the objector wants to reply, we have set down a deadline. We hope that they can provide within 14 days. If they can provide the information to us as soon as possible, then we can submit it to the CE in Council for consideration. Therefore, in subsections 9 and 10, we have set down by what means can the objector submit this objection to the government, including email, fax, etc. It also sets down the way of reply from the administration to the public. For public purposes, three types of works are added about the draft plan of the town planning ordinance. For the owner whose land is not resumed, they can raise objections by another means. I came across a case. A piece of land was resumed for road. Adjacent to the land created difficulty in access because of the difference in heights stated. Under this mechanism, how can that person express this? In 2E, it states whether monetary or non-monetary, or any financial or other assistance. It seems to be about compensation, but in English, it states assistance. That is necessary. Otherwise, the project cannot move on because of the great differences in heights stated. So how can the provisions reflect the situation? Because you are not resuming the land of that person, but then the land being resumed will affect the land of that person concerned, despite the fact that that person is not the owner of the land being resumed. How can the government mitigate the inconvenience caused to that person? With this mechanism, how can they make their voices heard? I'm not clear about this point. Thank you, Madam Chair. Using Mr. Tony Te's example, if a person has been using the land being resumed, such as a user of the land, we are flexible with the person having a right in relation to the land. If the resumption of the land will affect the right to use the land, then that will also be covered. But what about other compensation or assistance? I'm afraid we cannot deal with it on this occasion, but when we take forward the project, before the resumption of land by the Works Department, they will maintain close liaison with people in the community. If they do have such demands or requirements, these will be dealt with in due course at that stage. Upon the resumption of land, some people will say that there is no access for them. Where viable, we will provide access to these people. They will be considered part of the works. Well, you cannot ask somebody to climb up on a ladder because there are different heights stated. Ms. Carmen can. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to go back to the previous slide. For DEF, for the definitions of land being resumed for public purposes, road, sewerage, and railway works are added, and we can simplify the procedures. That is to say, all the areas in blue will be resumed in one go, so we do not have to separately make a plan, one of the yellow and one of the blue. I understand that this will expedite the whole process. As long as one meets the criterion of public purposes. Even if works are subject to Cap 370, then it will also be covered by Land Resumption Ordinance. Is that correct? Because the objections will have to be dealt with under this ordinance. Do you have a mirror amendment? There should be corresponding amendments for 2C amendment notice. The Lands Department is empowered to amend a proposal for land resumption before being submitted to the Chief Executive and Council, despite no objection in 2B, as long as the proposal has not been submitted to CE in Council, then the department can still make amendments. It is not the case that I cannot make amendments when nobody is objecting to it. As long as it has not been submitted to the CE in Council, they can still make amendments. Is that correct? For 2E, what is the purpose of 2E? Maybe Polly can walk us through 2E. Subsection 5. I don't quite understand the purpose of subsection 5. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Carmen Can. First, on the first question about road, sewerage, or railway works ordinance, will there be mirroring ordinances complementing the amendments of Cap 124? We have to see whether the ordinances are contrary to one another. Well, there are actually no contradictions. The main purpose of the ordinance is to gazette the road works. The flow is as such. First, we gazette the works. If the works involve resumption of land, then we have to resume the land. When the proposal is given the green light, then the government can invoke the right, the ordinance to resume land. If we invoke Cap 124 right now, it states very clearly, invoking Cap 124 will cover works that are gazetted. Works that are gazetted in parallel will not be affected. Cap 370 deals with alignment. We have discussed with the Department of Justice, and the provisions in the two ordinances will not run afoul of each other.
於修訂公
On the second point, the resumption notices, Ms. Carmen Khan is right. So even in the absence of an objection, there can be amendment notice. Say the department thinks there's room for improvement on the alignment, then the department can invoke Section 2C and amend the notice. Now the third question on Section 2E, subsection 5, the reason for this subsection. Let me talk about the flow in which we will deal with objections. My colleague, Ms. Pang, Ms. Fabia Tam, I thank the member for her question. On dealing with objections. In a moment, we will also get to the road works use and compensation ordinance, and there's also the foreshore and seabed reclamation ordinance. We have the same mechanism for handling objections. So here you have a flow chart. Section 2E, subsection 4. In the first box, on the left, the green box with white text. Let's take a step back. We were talking about the objections. After the notice is gazetted, objectors have 60 days in which they can lodge a written objection. That's in the bill. And then in this bigger grayish green box, we have a 5-month window for handling objections. Our goal is look at the box at the right in light blue with the objections and the government replies. All these documents go to the Chief Executive in Council for consideration. Let's go back to the bigger box in grayish green, Section 2E, subsection 4. The first box here, that's where this subsection is about. An objection is received and the government provides a written response. So that's the reply. And then subsection 5. The objector has 14 days to respond to the government's reply. The objector may say one of the followings. First, the objector unconditionally withdraws the objection, or partially agrees with the reply but partially sustains the objection. So then the objector conditionally withdraws the objection on the condition that the government does a certain thing, or the objector maintains their objection. Alternatively, the objector may say the government's reply is not detailed enough and asks for supplementary or new information from the government. Our experience is that the objector's response tends to fall within one of those categories. Now let's look at the black box at the bottom. Section 2E, subsection 4, and subsection 5. The gray box here touches on what we are trying to address under subsections 4 and 5. In dealing with the objections, the objector may simply give a late reply or no reply at all. We want to boost speed and efficiency. That's our overarching principle. So we want to deal with late or no response scenarios. So we want the objectors to give us a response within 14 days, and then we can wrap up the matter. The comments can be submitted to the Executive Council for deliberations. So that's what subsection 4 is all about. Now, Ms. Khan asked the question about what subsection 5 is for. Now, in the light green box here, the objector provides a response to the government's reply, and then we write to the objector again. We let the objector know that we acknowledge the position made by the objector on a certain day. That comment will go to the Chief Executive in Council for further consideration. Under subsection 5 of section 2E, this is just a notification. Simply put, the 14-day window will not start again. Subsection 5 is there to make sure the matter does not get dragged on over 14-day periods indefinitely. Madam Chair, so here it says does not constitute a reply. The wording here means it does not mean the objector gets another 14-day period. The objector's response will be submitted to the Chief Executive in Council. The response or the lack of response will go to the CENC, so that's what it means. Thank you, Madam Chair. Next, Mr. Louis Long. Madam Chair, for the mechanism about handling objections, is this a process involving purely the government and the objectors, and the exchanges will not be made public? Is that the case? Who's going to take the question, please? Now, the standing practice is to keep this process to the government and the objectors. There will be written correspondence and meetings. This is just between the government and the objectors. Now, there's a reason I put this question to you. On a site, the title may be scattered across multiple parties. A title owner raises an objection, but the other owners are unaware of this development. When that's the case, and the government keeps the matter between the government and the objector, so will the other owners of the same site be notified? Polly. The key point here is that the government has a line of communication with the objector. When any changes happen to the land resumption ordinance, then there will be an amendment notice that will go out under Section 2C, so everyone who may be affected will get a chance to lodge an objection. That's the key point. As for the exchange between the government and the objector, the government may maintain its decision, so making the exchange public may not make a difference. Now, from my experience, I know the government does not make public the information, but the objector can choose to make public the information. The objector can make the information online and air the grievances. The objector can go to a lawmaker or to the media. So there is no prohibition on the objector doing such things. No, there is no such restrictions. No other questions? Please go on. Now we're done with subsection 6. Now moving on to subsection 7 and 8. These are technical changes. This is similar to what you see under Cap 370 and the one on railways. The objection comes in. The objector has the right to amend the objection within the deadline. If the objector withdraws the objection, they can do that before the comments are submitted to the CENC. So these are technical amendments. Moving on. Subsections 9 and 10. These two subsections have to do with the 14-day window. Moving on. Section 2F, decision not to proceed with proposal for land resumption. After the Gazetted, the government decides against resuming the land before the matter goes to the CENC. The provision here requires that we put out a notice to notify the public. Under Cap 370 and the Railways Ordinance, similar provisions are there requiring the government to put out a notice and gazette the matter and also put out a notice at the site and also make the information online. Mr. Tony Tse, to clarify a point, a landowner is affected and incurs losses. So there's no mechanism for the landowner to claim damages or compensation. Is that the case? Indeed, there's no compensation in such cases. The land resumption proposal is a proposal, so the resumption has not happened yet. Under the law, there is no compensation mechanism. Madam Chair, when you get to that stage, the landowners think the government will resume the land for development. And then the government decides against resuming the land in the end. But the people to be affected may have undertaken some advanced preparatory work to facilitate the process. So is the government end up encouraging uncooperative behavior? Would this be the result? That is discouraging cooperative behavior. This could be a side effect. Polly. I think normally when someone sees a land resumption proposal, they think the government will take over the land soon. And then there will be a change in the way people behave on the site. Resumption or not, the government makes a decision within a time frame. The matter will not drag on indefinitely. The law says that within 2 + 5 months, the government has to arrive at a decision. We believe the impact will be limited. I'm saying that some people can claim compensation, but those whose land is not resumed are excluded. Nevertheless, they are affected. So these people have to shoulder the losses when the government decides against resumption in the land. That doesn't sound fair to those people affected. My question is, now when you do decide against resumption, you will put the information online at the land registry and you put up a notice at the site. But the government does not inform the affected people. Is that the normal practice? So the people affected have to look out for themselves. They have to look up the websites and look out for the notices. Is that the same under other ordinances? The drafting here is the same as what you will see under Cap 370 and the Railways Ordinance. There are other measures as administrative measures for us to notify the owners. At different stages of the resumption ordinance, the Lands Department delivers letters. They knock on every door. They let people know what happens. When the government decides against the resumption, we will let the people know in the same way. Moving on, Section 2G. Submission of proposal for land resumption to Chief Executive in Council. Here it says that the land resumption proposal has to go to the CENC within a time frame, and there is a procedure governing the process. Subsection 1, it sets out what we have to submit first, the proposal, the objection we receive, and also any amendment notice. All these things go to the CENC. Subsection 2, the time frame. This is where the 2 + 5 time frame comes in. Within 5 months after receiving the objections, the information goes to the CE in C. If there are amendment notices, and then within 3 months for making the objections, the information goes to the CE in C. Subsection 3, that's the extension. In certain cases, when need be, the Secretary for Development can approve 2-month extensions. When there are exceptional circumstances, there can be at most 2 extensions, each time 2 months. This is in alignment with what you see under the Town Planning Ordinance.
So it can be 2 plus 5 plus 2 plus 2? Well, it can be at most 2 plus 5 plus 2 plus 2. There can be 2 exceptional cases, 2 months each. So how does it differ in subsection 2 from subsection 3? In subsection 2 brackets B brackets Roman characters 2, in the course of dealing with objections, the deadline will not be simply 2 plus 5 if an amendment notice is issued. Then, after the 60-day period, within 3 months, it will have to be submitted. If it has to be extended, then 2 months will be added after the 3 months deadline. Page 14, subsections 4 and 5. The public consultation will be conducted in parallel. Land resumption is predicated on the confirmation of land planning use. So, land planning has to come before land resumption. Any question? If there's no question, please go on. On to page 15, part 3. That is an existing part. That is the procedure for the Chief Executive in Council in considering a proposal for land resumption. We have to extend the current subsection 3. There are different provisions, some new and some old. Now on to subsection 1 and 2. They are existing provisions, and the subsection 3 is rather straightforward, saying that the Chief Executive and Council can authorize the resumption of any land, but we have drawn reference from Roads Ordinance and Railway Ordinance. They set out clearly what options the Chief Executive and Council has. They can approve the resumption of land. They can also make amendments. They can impose the relevant amendments. They can reject the application, or they can reconsider afresh. All those are from other ordinances. If the CE in Council decides to amend, then will the application be subject to consultation again? No, this decision will be final. When the Chief Executive in Council thinks that some objections should be entertained, then they will be amended on that occasion. We do not anticipate that they will be sent back all over to the applicant once again. On page 16, subsection 3, that is an old provision. It is written in the same way. If the Chief Executive and Council authorizes the resumption of any land under subsections 1 or 2, while subsections 1 or 2, the CE may order the resumption of the land in accordance with the authorization. Subsection 4 is a new provision. It also reflects the work being conducted in tandem. Subsection 5 is a new provision. It is an enhancement. If the CE in Council declines to authorize the resumption of the land, then the authority must publish a notice, must gazette the relevant rejection, etc. Any approval will be covered in Section 4 notices. On to page 17. Section 4 notices. When the Chief Executive orders land resumption, then we will have to put our notice. And that is the way in which the notice is made. On the right, we have stated that the authority must publish a copy of the notice on the website of the authority and make a copy of the notice available for inspection by the public free of charge at the time and place as the authority reasonably directs. It is usually a government office. We also included this avenue. At a later stage, we will have a committee stage amendment. And that is similar to what we previously covered, ABE, that is 3A, page 17, on the website, time, place. Well, there is a difference. In a specified time, date, it will be made public, but then there is no such avenue in 2A. Because we wouldn't have a large stack of plans if we are not going to resume land. When we resume land, however, there will be a large stack of plans which will be made available for the public's reference outside government offices. Now on to page 18, part 4. It is a new part. It provides a mechanism. After approval of the CE in Council, if need be, if there needs to be rationalization, this is a mechanism for us to adjust the delineation of the land. The structure is similar to 2E and 2F. We will have to put up a notice and collect objections. This is also subject to public monitoring. I will walk you through each provision. Well, it is about the proposed adjustment, and that is different from what you mentioned, modify. Is that correct? Well, they are similar in nature. The amendment notice actually amends the delineation, whereas this one is adjusting the boundary. That is, one is the amendment of boundary, and this is the adjustment of the boundary. I will explain some wording, the interpretation of some wording in 5A. First of all, subject land, which is the area in orange, i.e. the area for which resumption has been approved. So the area or the boundary we have to adjust is the orange area. And for proposed adjustment, it is the area in green. Notice of proposed adjustment will be covered in the next provision. That is, we will have to publish a notice specifying what has to be adjusted. Now, on to Section 5B, Notice of Proposed Adjustment. The purpose of this subsection is to make it clear if the government has to adjust the boundary, then the government will have to put up a notice of proposed adjustment. We drew reference from 2A, and I will walk you through each and every provision. In subsection 1, it states clearly the point of time of the adjustment. This is rather complicated, and I will use a PowerPoint. I will use a graph to walk you through the slide. Well, if you have got a lot to cover, then let us save it for the next meeting. I have other engagements about the district council. If there is no particular question for detailed explanations, we can save it for the next meeting. We have 4 hours. On page 17, how will you get a hold of the landowner? That is for page 17.4, which is an old provision. If you can get a hold of the landowner, and you will do so and so. But what if you cannot get a hold of the landowner? Will you not resume the land? This means that if we can get a hold of the landowner, then we will serve the notice. Otherwise, we will put up the notice on the premises. Section 4 means that if we have put up the notice, that means we have already served the notice to the landowner involved. I recommend we call it a day today, and we can start again next week. We will have 4 hours from 2:30 to 6:30. Thank you, members. Meeting adjourned.